Hey, everybody. Welcome back to season 1 of Public Voices. I'm Doug.
And I'm Nicole.
That is, you are, in fact, Nicole, and I'm Doug. So today we're going to talk about the cost of poor communication. And today we're naming names. Well, okay, not literally naming names, but we are going to get really specific.
And before we dig in, let's take a quick second to thank our sponsor, NEOGOV, who makes this podcast possible. So let's get into it. Doug, when you hear cost of poor communication, what's the first thing that comes to your mind?
Well, I mean, I think in my career, and I think of all the examples of times where there's been opportunities to communicate better. And when I think of poor communication, generally, before I get into the example, I think of just missed opportunities to make sure that people understand everybody's on the same playing field, so to speak, to not to oversimplify it, but that's what I think about. And when I think about maybe a specific time, when I was in my time as a police chief leading an agency, we went through a CAD RMS transition, or a computer aided dispatch and records management system. For those of you that don't have that type of experience, basically all of our dispatching and all of our record system, we changed from one vendor to another vendor. And that happens a lot in public safety agencies, where you move from one thing to the next. And it is not an easy, it's not like flicking a switch. It's not like you just say sign the contract and just turn it on, we're good to go. It's not that easy. Far from it. Is one of the most complex things that you can do in a public safety agency, not because of the complexity of the process and the project itself, but also the time it takes to get it done, because we're talking months, possibly a year, possibly longer, for it to really be done. So when I look back specifically at the example that I was going to go down with this, was we were happy to leave the vendor we were with, because we were going to a new vendor, and there were some other things that this new vendor was going to offer us that was just better suited to our organization. So when they came in, did the pitch, and we ended up moving forward, signing the contract. We were, I think, all very excited about what the opportunity of the future of our CAD system and our RMS system would really look like as we continued down the course of public safety within that jurisdiction. On paper, it looked great. And when we talked about what this looked like within the organization, people knew that we were going to do it. Hey, everybody, this is kind of what we're doing. But I think that's where we sort of stopped communicating about the project. There were people and players involved that needed to be involved. Unfortunately, that list was not as comprehensive as it should have been. And as I look back on a lesson learned, particularly on this, there needs to be a lot of people at the table that sometimes you don't necessarily think about. And sometimes as bosses or leaders, we don't see everything in terms of, who all should be joining us necessarily, or who is the subject matter expert on this. And sometimes we rely on other people to bring those folks to the table, because we just may not know. In that case, we missed out on a few folks. And when you're doing a massive project like that, I mean, it's very IT heavy. It's very, very intricate on the comms side for 911. And having worked, yourself in a center like that, I mean, there are specific things that you want to be able to do in a 911 center, for example, just to do your job. There are also things within the records part of the department, or the back end of things, how we get the reports and processes done here or there, or, what's that process look like? And sometimes I think we just take for granted that, well, this is how it works generally, and we don't go into the depth or complexities. So that's where we failed, because I think we neglected to bring enough people that really had a kind of a practical, hands-on, day-to-day operational knowledge and historical viewpoint to the process and to the project, that really could have, I think, helped us avoid a few of the pitfalls that we did run into during that process. And so I think when I think of poor communication, I think specifically that example, because I think there were missed opportunities to really communicate. We all knew the why of what we were going to do, why were we transitioning, but the how part was where we really missed out. And I think that was the crux of, what that really kind of looked like. It was super challenging to us. And I think if I were to go back and do it again, I think, I know I would do it differently.
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting because I've heard over the years employees when there's big projects going on in their work group, feel excluded because they aren't included in those projects. And I think in your example, it wasn't intentional to leave anyone out. It was just a general oversight or not having those learning lessons to know who to include. And I think it's so important for employees that know they should have a role in that to raise their hand and say, hey, I didn't get invited to that meeting, but I can bring value to the project and here's how, versus being upset about it and, just saying that they were left out intentionally, because that's typically not the case. There's just so many things going on, especially with a large transition like that it's just an oversight, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there were some people kind of I would call it at the line level that really had a fantastic operational knowledge and awareness of
Mm-hmm.
things. And I was told later that a few people did, in fact, to your precise example of raising their hand and saying, "Hey, I think I can help." I found out later they did that, and they were sort of
Oh,
said, "No, we got it, we're good."
sure.
And I, of course, found out after the fact, but
Yeah.
yeah, I think being able to raise your hand and bring that expertise to the table is something that really helps all of us. And it's not about ego in these things. It's about
Mm-hmm.
working together as a team to accomplish this particular mission or task. And
Yeah.
areas for improvement, no doubt, in that instance.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So what do you think that cost your agency, just having, potentially excluding key players throughout part of that process?
Yeah, I think it would not only did it actually cost more because there were things that we would think about and say, no, we have to go back and redo this. So that's an extra cost on top of the contract because we had to redo some things, which was a bit messy. But I think it also kind of made people feel like, well, even if I say something, it doesn't matter. And ultimately, that's frustration on the end user. It's not, I'm not the one doing reports every day, for example. I'm not the one getting dispatched to calls every day. I'm in an office as a chief, but those that didn't have the say and didn't come to the table, I think it makes them less willing to maybe raise their hand down the road and be a part of things, even though they have an incredible amount to give. When we don't ask that or we don't invite that, I think that becomes problematic.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a
Yeah.
good
So, all
example.
right. So you quizzed me, right?
Uh-huh.
So right back at you, my friend. What are we talking
Mhm.
about when like there's like a specific time or some instance where there was a problem because of poor communication?
Yeah, so this was really hard for me to come up with an example, not because I'm a great communicator. I just feel like I've blocked out all the bad communication because it can be stressful and overwhelming. But I did think of one good example. So, fun fact, even though I was with my agency for a total of almost 20 years, when I hit my 10-year mark, I actually quit. And I didn't have a job and I didn't have a plan, but I just wanted to go try something else. So I went and worked for the private sector eventually, and I came back. My dream job back at the city opened up, and I got that job. And so this story is more about me not communicating well,
Okay.
but my ego plays a huge role in it because as a newbie coming back, that's very unusual for someone to leave an agency and then come back in a higher role. And so I felt like I had to prove myself. I felt pretty insecure and wanted to make sure that people felt like I should be in that HR leadership role. And so I worked on a project. One of the first things that I was assigned was to work with the PD to restructure their dispatch center. And they wanted more of a career path and kind of a hierarchy internally amongst their dispatchers. And so I worked on that project. I gave them multiple options. I made sure I calculated the cost of what it would be to implement that and what all the job titles would be and all the things. And I delivered that proposal to the chief, the deputy chief, and the dispatch manager. They all loved it. Yes, this is exactly what we're looking for. Let us take it to the city manager for approval. So I knew what day they were meeting with the city manager. And that day came and went, and I didn't hear anything. And then the next day, someone from finance called and they were asking me questions about that proposal. And they were basically implying that they were going to redo my work. And so I got super defensive because I was not, I was the newbie that was a little insecure. So I started, interrogating that person, like, why are you working on this? Why are you questioning this project? And he was kind of taken off guard. And he's like, I don't know. The deputy chief just called me and asked me to work on it. Like, this is the first time I've heard of it. And so I spent days being upset with the deputy chief and the chief because I felt like they didn't trust my work. I felt like they, were dishonest and didn't like the proposal. So they went around me to ask someone else to do something different. And I was livid. And the amount of time and energy I spent being upset about that is completely bonkers. And so finally, after like 4 or 5 days, I said, I'll just call the deputy chief and see what's going on. And so I did. And I was like, hey, I got this phone call from finance. What's going on with that proposal? And he said, oh, yeah, absolutely. We took it to the city manager. He loved all the ideas. And I know you're really busy. And city manager asked us to combine two of the ideas. So I just asked finance to do it really quickly for me. So I like immediately like physically deflated, right? Because I had made it all about me, that they didn't like me, they didn't like my work, and that absolutely wasn't the case. And so it's just an interesting example to show, how you can get caught up in those stories and get caught up in your emotions. And really, nothing had anything to do with me or my work. It was just they were actually trying to be polite to me and not give me more work and ask finance for help. So the poor communication was me making assumptions and maybe deputy chief not just closing the loop after they had the meeting. But just a fascinating example because we all have done that, right? We've all made assumptions and gotten riled up and then realized, oh, that probably wasn't worth it to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, and first, thanks for like sharing that because it's a personal story, right? And
Mhm.
and you take pride in your work, and as leaders, we do take a lot of pride, and with that comes that ownership. And when
Yeah.
it's a project that you're working on, they're very proud of, the people seem very interested in, it works you up, you get excited about it, and then when things seem to go in a different direction,
Yeah.
we just get defensive naturally, and then we fill in the
Mhm.
space in the
Yeah.
absence of information, we fill in that
Mhm.
space automatically and start doing it. And it's what you did. And I'm guilty of it. I think all of our listeners and our viewers can think of a specific time, and they're probably doing that right now. Of like, oh yeah, I did it. They raised
Right.
their hand. I've done it too. Everybody raised their
Mm.
hand because you've all done it. So that's the challenge. And so when we talk about poor communication, those types of issues, I wonder why this type of thing kind of keeps happening. And we can't just label everybody, well, we don't know how to communicate anymore. And arguably, even though in an age like today where we're texting and nobody wants phone calls, they want text messages and all these types of things, communication is a little different of a little more infrequent uh, trait to find in somebody when they're a good communicator. It's
Mhm.
just different now. But that said, I don't think people are bad communicators. I do think that there are several things that I think come up that I would say are kind of challenges to how we approach that. And I think we sometimes assume that when we do communicate, that the other person understands exactly what we're talking about. Like I say something to you, you nod, and then we move on to the next. I assume, well, Nicole understands what I just said. She gets
Right.
it, but I never verified afterwards necessarily. So, like in
Mhm.
your particular instance, you and the deputy chief, are we good? What are the next steps? How can I help? Those types of things we never verify. And the same
Yeah.
process when I look back at my own example, same type of thing, right? And then we
Mhm.
say something once, we move on, we go to the next. So I think there are several different, I guess, drivers of why we have communication breakdowns. And I think a lot of it has to do with like closing the loop on an issue
Mhm.
necessarily. And given your background in HR, I'm sure you've seen a lot of this, whether it's been with employees or other challenges. I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
No, I think closing the loop is huge. And actually, I used that story in a different training with leaders, and deputy chief happened to be in the class. And when I started telling the story, I like looked at him and said, "Do you remember this?" Because it was a meaningful. I mean, that was 10 years ago, and I'm still talking about it. And he kind of shook his head, like, "I don't know what you're gonna talk about." And as I started telling the story, he smirked and he was like, "I remember this one." And what was really great about me sharing that with a group of leaders was that he said, hey, can I share my learning lesson from that as well? And he said, I should have done better to, tell Nicole how the meeting went with the city manager and what our next steps were. He said, I shouldn't have left her hanging. And so I appreciated that he had a learning lesson from that as well. But I think at the end of the day, two things with communication. One, especially in my example, I assumed bad or negative things, right? I didn't
Mhm.
assume, oh, they loved it, it's magical, right? I went to, it's bad and it's about me. So I think if we could be more neutral or not automatically assume the worst when there's lack of communication or confusion. And I think too, we have to make sure that we have that culture where people feel safe to clarify and just raise their hand and say, hey, in the meeting, you made this comment. I took it as X. Is that what you meant? Or, you gave me this assignment. Can you help me clarify exactly what you meant? I mean, it's so important that people feel comfortable to just make sure all those details are correct, because if not, then that's where everyone gets off the path, and then it kind of derails in the long run.
Yeah, I agree. And it's funny because sometimes we only communicate, like cross communicate within divisions or departments
Hmm.
when there's a problem.
Yes.
We that's when we go and we try and like say, hey, there's an issue with this, and it's maybe the first or second time I've really had a conversation with you, because
Sure.
normally
Yeah.
you just don't know. So I think
Hmm.
that's one of the challenges too, is we don't have that direct connection with people. We don't have the rapport. We don't have the trust. And the irony of it all, I suppose, is that particularly in public safety, we don't want to address a community issue during times of crisis without having any relationship before. We want to build that relationship up to that crisis point so they know, yeah, okay, this bad thing happened, but we trust you, so we can kind of work through it a little better than just kind of coming out and saying, you've never met with us once about anything,
Right.
and now there's a problem and you want us to trust you. It just doesn't
Yeah.
fit. So
Yeah.
maybe you've seen things like that as well too.
Yeah, absolutely. I actually had a similar issue with payroll, because we were in different divisions, and payroll and HR have to work very closely hand in hand. And we just kind of were going through a new software and experiencing errors. And so I decided to just do. We had two meetings a month, right? But it was more so not to only discuss the bad things, but just to build rapport and like, how was your weekend? How are your kids' soccer games? Because then when those big things did pop up, we were ready. We had that trust. We knew kind of who in the group was the key players to help correct them. And so I think, yeah, it is important to not only talk to your peers when there's bad things going on, even if you just did quarterly meetings with your, fellow user groups or whatever. It really does help break the ice when there is a bigger thing that pops up.
Yep. And as you reflected on your own story, I think of mine, and I really consider that the opportunity that was presented back then that I should have capitalized on, of really going out and talking to the people that do the work, to say, you know what, I want you to go through this and tell me what you think. You're the one that does the work.
Hmm.
And I think as a leader, I missed that opportunity. I relied
Sure.
on chain of command to carry it down, and that does not always work. Sometimes
Hmm.
it actually gets worse. So I think that's a missed opportunity for sure. And as you move on, we make those mistakes. Thankfully, nobody gets hurt in the process, but it doesn't do much to build trust when you have those types of issues too.
Yeah, absolutely. I would say in my example, my ego was a little hurt. Thankfully, there
Hmm.
was no other feelings involved.
Yep.
But my takeaway from my example is I should have just clarified in the moment versus sat on it for several days and been upset with people for no reason. And I think really the ripple of that is, even though that I was able to resolve that in a few days, the damage that could have done with me and that deputy chief in our relationship going forward, because I could have essentially held a grudge for the next 10 years. And that individual eventually became chief, right? And so I think it's just so important to nip it in the bud when you can, because you don't want it to impact your relationships going forward and have a perception of someone that is potentially inaccurate.
Yeah, I agree. And I think one thing that we do need to be very cautious about across the board is when we send out information via like an electronic email or a memo or whatever it happens to be, or we had a meeting and maybe there was no discussion. Um, do people truly understand what they're supposed to be doing?
Hmm.
What's that level of understanding? We sometimes confuse sending out information with actual communication. Like, well,
Hmm.
we sent it out in a memo, everybody should know and should understand that. Or we announced this new policy, everybody should understand that. But that's actually not the case in a lot of ways.
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
it's really kind of looping back to make sure that people get what the message is and what the why is. We've talked about the why a
Yes.
few times before, making sure people really understand what that reality is and what that impact could be and what that is. And I think there's also an opportunity to use, to be careful with the words we use. Like urgent
Hmm.
to me may not be urgent to you, or something that's high priority or whatever else may mean different to somebody, because I have everything I do is high priority. So
Yes.
where on the high
Right.
priority scale is this fall. So I think there are some language issues to make sure that clarity is the most important thing we take away from that.
Well, and with the language, it's so important to realize that most work groups have their own language. And
Mhm.
if you're talking to someone in an external group, they're not following that same language. Several years ago, I was asked kind of on a whim to run municipal court. I don't speak court at all. That's not my background. And I did not understand anything that was going on. And I remember going to a meeting, and it was with law enforcement and all sorts of outside agencies, and they were talking at a level and in a language that I truly did not understand. And so afterwards, I just raised my hand and said, "Okay, can someone just summarize this to me like I'm a kindergartner? Because I don't know what you just said. I don't know what I'm supposed to take back to my work group." And they were all very kind and gracious and laughed about it. But I could understand maybe 10% of what they were trying to accomplish because of the words they were using. And so I think just to be mindful if you're working with other work groups that aren't used to those acronyms or those terms, to maybe articulate that as well.
Yeah, I think that's the importance of doing things together collectively, and we found
Hmm.
that out during, key crisis times where it's not just one department doing something; it's multiple departments working together cross functionally. But we don't I don't loop over into necessarily the
Hmm.
HR or the streets department or parks or wastewater or fire for that matter. But every function is important, particularly during like
Yes.
a time of high crisis. Maybe a storm comes through or something. So we all
Hmm.
have to work together in a way that makes sense. But the languages, it's like, I speak Greek, they speak
Hmm.
Latin, they speak
Yes.
Italian. And so
Hmm.
somehow we've got to get a universal Rosetta Stone to bring us all
Yes.
together
Right.
to really translate what that looks like. But I think that establishing that communication and making sure we understand, at least we have a level playing field, is critically important.
Hmm. So, we typically do takeaways, but I think we both just did like three takeaways each without framing it as a takeaway.
I think so too, and I think
Yeah.
when we talk about takeaways, I think if I were to say one thing that I want to just reinforce throughout this whole thing is when it comes to major decisions within an organization, no matter what that happens to look like, um, it, it's a good idea to really to leave the ego at the door and to say, look, I can't pretend to know everything, so I need to bring the
Mhm.
right people in the room to really help me understand what the problem is, and then some potential or ways to solve the problem, and who are the right people to actually help fix that problem, and what that really looks like. And it's if I'm not the one, which probably is the case, who is that, and then how can I help them get to
Mhm.
that point where I can give them, empower them or trust them with whatever it happens to be, and then let them go and do that thing to help solve the job. And I think as I matured in my leadership roles, I was more I was more open to doing those kinds of things because I saw the value of it when it worked, and when it did work, it worked really really well, and it built trust within the organization
Mhm.
because people feel like they could, again to your earlier point, raise their hand and say,
Mhm.
I've got an idea. So I think that's my takeaway, is to be open to those things.
Yeah, that's a great takeaway. I would say mine is just giving yourself permission to be curious and ask
Yep.
questions and clarify. And even if in the moment you feel stupid, or you think someone's going to, think less of you for asking the question, do it anyways because you will feel better having more information than trying to play the guessing game.
Agreed. Good takeaway,
Perfect.
Nicole.
Yeah, thanks. What a great episode.
This has been one of our best episodes. I mean,
What great communication we have on this
this is
episode.
fantastic. We didn't assume anything about one another or anything. It's been
Yeah,
amazing. So
right.
there we
I
go.
love it. Okay, well, thanks for joining Public Voices, and thanks again to our sponsor, NeoGov, the leading HR software provider for public sector, for supporting our conversations. Be sure to follow and stream wherever you listen, and don't forget to rate us.
Yeah, and if there's a topic that you want us to cover, or a perspective you want to hear, or a comment you'd like to leave about this episode or any other episode, believe me, we would love to hear from you. So please contact us and give us your thoughts. We would welcome that. But until next time, same time next week, and we will see you soon.
Ignite is refreshing. You come here to connect with people and to learn about future forward things NEOGOV is doing.
We've loved the speakers this morning, the opening session, and just networking with a wide variety of people from all over.
One word I will describe Ignite is fantabulous. Connection.
Innovation.
Empowering.
Unifying.
Networking.
I want to say like mind-blowing just because there's so much information.
Save your seat at neogov.com/ignite.